Any moment.
We'll be back in time for the pizza.
The important stuff.
Hello, everybody. We are Thursday, the 31st of March, Climate Solutions Caucus. On our agenda today are a couple of the co-chairs of the Climate Action Plan, Ag and Ecosystems, which is also sort of resilience, but it's not in your name, right? I always think it is. So a couple of guests to just orient us to their recommendations and how we're doing in terms of session, because they have not been the sort of high profile pieces.
Here's your pizza.
Oh. Hey, well, let's take a quick break. We'll come back to, and Abby, thanks for being with us, and we're gonna be on, just be a second. Can we pause our streamage? Never mind. It's all right. They can watch it. It's a riveting video.
Everyone loves being watched. It's funny.
Some of the trash.
Yeah.
Shoes on napkin. Plain, pepperoni. There's 3 plain, 1 vegetable, and 1 pepperoni. And that is might be a gluten-free.
I think those are with the
Thank you. There is not even plates.
No plates.
No, I mean, everybody at all.
You know what we've done in the past is
How are you?
just rip the.
You hire me.
I don't mind.
Do you know somebody that applied for a job?
You have a job of
Sorry.
like legislative stuff or your old job, maybe you want.
Yeah.
Yes,
Did somebody,
Yeah,
We
yeah.
should touch it.
there were boxes.
You have it in there.
I'm picking that up.
Did you have a lot of applicants? That's great.
Especially in this area.
Yeah, I know. People are saying that. Big agencies.
Oh, yeah. Especially with the COVID retirees.
Right, yeah. They've had a lot of retirements.
Some extra paper towel as well.
Oh, right on. We made a few plates.
That's a good thing.
I think this is. Oh,
Same.
Yeah. Lots of cheese.
Let's start anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe 2 plates.
Someone put their stuff down here. Okay.
All right, so I'm gonna turn it over to you. You and Abby,
Yeah, it's a big screen.
I love that. Sort of broaden, like, the loss of the town was on that. This is the continuous feedback that we need to have. Or I can just sit over here. You guys can have the table.
That's fine.
I can sit over there. I took it home. I'm not gonna keep it, but I just want to let whoever's, I have a Smith kitchen, but
In the winter.
I think I did one time bring a book. Did you? It is. It might be yours. I'll go home if I don't have
Okay.
some kind of Schmidt.
No, I'm not gonna keep it. I'm gonna bring it back. I just wanted you to
I
know
just,
that.
yeah.
If you're looking for a recipe or something. Robin, blue cover for the plan, so just put it in the door, so if you see it, just stick
Okay.
it in the kitchen somewhere.
This is what. Okay. I'm not affecting that. Okay.
All right, are we ready to? Thanks, Bob. All right, so welcome back. Thanks for being patient with us as we grabbed our little bit of lunch here. So Chris introduced what this check-in is about, and I just wanted to also have us acknowledge that this needs to be a regular set of dialogue that happens between the Climate Solutions Caucus and the council. And we will be doing this for years to come, right? Because the council is helping us with navigating how to get to 2025, how to get to 2030 and beyond. And so I think it's going to be important for all of you in your policy committees to be thinking in terms of checking in on recommendations that come out of the council that might go to your policy committee, but then also us as a caucus as a whole. I think it's important to check in and ask the question of this council that we created. How are we doing? What do we have in motion right now that was part of the recommendations? What did we not get in motion that you want us to prep for next year? What's coming down in terms of future recommendations? So that's sort of the larger context of this conversation and a notice that this will be the first of many conversations like this.
And I would just add, last meeting we had an overview of all the bills and the budget, what's in the budget, and particularly the ag and ecosystem recommendations were did not spawn, to my knowledge, a specific bill. And so we wanted seemed like an appropriate time to check in, see if some of the recommendations were taken, and since we still have some time to correct, maybe more work for us to do. So with that, I would turn it over to Abby Course and Lauren Oates, who Abby on video and Lauren right here, and ask for your take it away.
Abby, I'm going to jump in first since I'm in person and then hand it over to you if that's okay. Great. Well, thank you for the invite today. I'm especially grateful to hear that the intention is that there will be more communication between the caucus and Climate Council. There's a lot of work being done here and some moving pieces still within the Climate Action Plan. And as you intimated, it's going to be a multi-year process. When Senator Pearson asked if we could come in today, it was an acknowledgement that a lot of the focus, as you just mentioned, has been on the emissions reduction strategies, and that there is still significant need and interest in adaptation and resilience. So some of you might know me in my capacity at the Nature Conservancy, but today I'm here as a counselor. I was appointed to represent subject matter expertise and resilience. So I'm here as that. I'm not here as a council representative, though. I'm here as an individual with my own perspectives. And Abby, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then I'll give kind of a high-level update before you jump back in.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. Abby Course, I'm the Farm and Forest Sector Representative to the Vermont Climate Council and have been a co-chair of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. A little bit of background, I farm down in Whitingham, Vermont with my folks. We're a majority female-run organic dairy, shipping milk to Organic Valley. We're solar powered and have been rotationally grazing since the 1960s and we're the first site in the state for the mentor grazer site for the dairy grazing apprenticeship program, which will tie into I hope, some of what we'll touch on in a little bit about workforce development, particularly as it ties into the agricultural sector. And I'll turn it back to Lauren.
Thanks, Abby. So a common theme both within the budget, the draft budget, the Global Warming Solutions Act, and kind of even the complexion of the council seats has been that those of us that are focused more on the adaptation and resilience side have had a more difficult time kind of advancing some key strategies and policies, many of which have co-benefits on the climate mitigation front too. So I, again, really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to the importance of those with you all today. Senator Pearson asked that I be very specific with some of the recommendations. So we have a couple of broad framing for the importance of this work, and then a list of specifics that we've run by a couple of the other counselors who are also more focused on the adaptation and resilience scope of things. So before I go into those specific recommendations, and Abby will probably have some as well to add on. Abby, did you want to frame up the importance of the natural and working landscape for climate as a solution? And then I can go into the specifics.
I can try. This is how Lauren and I do things. I'm like the macro level, and Lauren is so good at coming up with the specifics. I'm terrible at specifics, but I think what became really apparent during this process was that, resilience and adaptation metrics are really difficult to establish, which I assume is why, they weren't captured that way in the GWSA. But I do think that it sets us up for some trickiness with how we're pursuing this work and what we're leaving behind because of the focus that the Act takes and puts on emissions reduction and sort of the tendency to focus there versus thinking in a more holistic or comprehensive way regarding how resilience can feed into the entire scope of we call it the three-legged stool of climate solutions, mitigation, adaptation, and now I'm going to forget, storage, sequestration. Lauren, is that the third one? And so it's been difficult, right? To prioritize these things, to try to, when we're thinking about things in an emissions reduction framework, it feels difficult to think about how these things specifically apply to climate change or work through the lens of climate change. But I think that's some of what the work ahead is to do. From my perspective and my vantage point of lived experience, stewarding land, when we look at things holistically as we approach climate change, the emissions reduction buckets the mitigation starts to happen as we move through the measures of resilience and adaptation. But when we're just pursuing emissions reduction strategy, the holistic framework as to how you can also achieve resilience and adaptation, not that it's not addressed, but sometimes it's just not fully encapsulated in the way that we really need it to in terms of developing really thoughtful and effective policy, regulatory frameworks, funding mechanisms, et cetera. And so we're just trying to help today give a few more concrete examples of sort of the ways in which kind of, sometimes it's just boring funding. It's not, it's not exciting. It's not new necessarily, but is really fundamental to making sure that the capacity is there for the people on the ground to do the work that's necessary to build out the resilience capacity of our natural and working lands. I'll stop there.
So some specifics, and Abby, jump in if I'm missing anything. We kind of couched them into budget and policy categories, many of which are actively moving within the building now, and we're hoping to seek your support on them. And some might be broader themes that would warrant a multi-year next biennium strategy. Feel free to ask any questions, and hopefully the two of us can clarify or answer them as we go. And I'm happy to send this in afterwards if helpful. All right, so budget first. These are mostly recommendations from the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. There are a couple that we pulled in from Rural Resilience and Adaptation as well. So the first is, and this is not prioritized, full statutory funding for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. We understand that the governor's budget came out at about 10 million. The draft House, well, the House budget came out and they increased it by another 10. So we have we're going at a 10-fold increase here to get to that full statutory funding of just over 30 million. Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, you know, the nexus of housing and conservation is really community, and that we're both in a climate crisis and a housing crisis seems to warrant real understanding and capacitating of that group, and not doing it in a way that will create a post-ARPA, post-infrastructure cliff, funding cliff that they have to respond to. So we would like to see some sustainable funding and the full statutory amount. Similarly, funding for the regional planning commissions. So much of the climate action plan solutions and recommendations fall on our municipalities and regional government to implement at the local, especially rural scale, and relying heavily on the RPCs to be the implementers or help us convey implementation. Is we want to make sure that we're funding them appropriately. I saw in that House budget that they have increased. There hasn't been a base increase in 20 years until this year. So we're really grateful to see that base increase, but we hope that that will be something that carries forward again so that we don't create that funding cliff. One of the key strategies from both agriculture and ecosystems and rural resilience and adaptation was to fund natural resource-based and climate and energy-based positions with the RPCs. And we'd like to see those be full-time permanent, not just once off while ARPA and infrastructure is available. There are a couple around workforce development, which should probably come as no surprise. Specifically, we recommend full funding for Vhcb's Farm and Forest Viability Program. Abby can speak to the importance of that if there are questions there. And similarly, increased funding for the Working Lands Enterprise Board, acknowledging that a lot of what we need is not just capacitating these working lands and natural lands entities, but also making sure that they have the technical assistance and education to do the work that we're expecting of them, both on adaptation and resilience and mitigation scale for carbon sequestration and storage. Funding for additional positions within the conservation districts, NRCS and UVM extension is part of that as well. And we can again get into more specifics or send those up as follow-up. And just generally greater financial and technical support again for municipalities who are expected to carry out a significant role in addressing climate resilience and mitigation more broadly. Something that's near and dear to my heart, the climate resilience section of the draft governor's budget essentially only covers home buyouts. I used to work for the state and that was the program that I managed there. So I'm deeply excited to see that there are two different pots of funding totaling 25 million to go to that. But that is not a comprehensive look at climate resilience. And if we are only looking at flood resilience primarily through the eyes of buyouts, we are not going to make the necessary moves that we need to make. So it would be great if, now that it's passed the House, for the senators in the room, as you look at that, to kind of open up the scope of that funding and allow it to be more broadly about flood resilience, especially when we're hearing that there are people who are interested in doing a buyout, but there is no housing inventory in Vermont for them to then move into. So there are floodplain restoration and reconnection opportunities that effectively lower floodplains in entire communities. It's much cheaper, it lets people stay in their communities, and it's much more cost effective. So just broadening that out. And then supporting technical assistance requests from the Climate Council. Abby can definitely jump more deeply into this. This is near and dear to agriculture and ecosystems heart, but that we understand that our greenhouse gas emissions inventory is appropriately counting for all of the different sectors they're in our case, agriculture, as well as building out supplemental tools to really understand what our natural working lands are doing as far as net emissions and carbon sequestration and storage. We want to make sure that we're building policies that are elevating the roles that our lands are playing in climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as the roles that we need at the consumer scale and otherwise to reduce emissions. That was a lot, but that was budget. Abby, did I miss anything, or are there any questions in the room? Thank you.
Could you just I have the list now in my mind. Could you just say, full funding of VHCB is actually 30, the House was 20?
Right.
Like, can you just now itemize it or put the numbers next to that list?
Yep. I can for that. The House recommended 21 million. I think full statutory funding would be about 32 or 33 million. So that's still a gap. With respect to VHCB Farm and Forest Viability Program, I believe that our recommendation from the Climate Council was to fund it at 3 million. An ARPA-based recommendation from the Climate Council around the Working Lands Enterprise Board was to add 5 million to that. And I don't know, I know that there's H703 I don't know where it is, unfortunately, maybe House members do, but it's a big workforce development bill. And just to keep your eye on that and make sure that these types of workforce development strategies are showing up there, I think would be really important. Governor's budget around the 25 million for flood resilience. Please keep it at that, but again, broaden the eligibility so that it can include broader flood resilience strategies. And the supporting for technical assistance requests from the Climate Council around emissions inventory, I believe are about 100,000-ish each. So no more than 200,000, but maybe lower, closer to 125.
Did we do those?
Well, no.
Okay.
Not the latter,
yet. Okay.
not the latter.
Okay.
I think that there's a grant application request in with the U.S. Climate Alliance to do some of that inventorying work, but a grant is just a grant and not necessarily funding. So again, as we think about communicating more between the Climate Council and this caucus especially, that would be something that if money could be found to fund that through you all and your purchase, that would be especially helpful.
There was something in the budget adjustment too that we should figure out. I thought around some of the inventory. What about extension?
I don't know the number that we specifically, but we said for positions, about 3 new positions for extension, whatever that would amount to. And then conservation district, at least an additional 1 per, and same with NRC.
Lauren, the conservation districts do have I'm not sure where it's at, and I apologize for that, but they did request a specific amount in the governor's budget, and I think we could reference that. That was intended to try to build out the statutory capacity for them to be able to hire in and keep positions that are viable for their folks to keep the consistency of that program. I want to say it was a total of around 3 million this year, but I could be remembering that wrong.
And we can follow up on that. And one thing that Abby and I talked about ahead of this actually is that a lot of the recommendations around funding, especially from our subcommittee, were also really vetted through the Vermont Farm to Plate Network process, which was another really robust stakeholder planning process so it's kind of doubly vetted that this is a good source of revenue and investment by you all as you develop the budget.
Turn it over to Abby.
Any other, I guess.
Yeah.
Abby has-
Oh, sorry.
You said something about floodplain mitigation. I forget the term you used, but what exactly are you talking about that and doing that?
Yep, so there are 2 pots of funding that amount to 25 million under
Is
the.
this just removing homes from the floodplain?
Yes. Yep.
Locating prisons.
Yep, and so we're saying broaden the scope of that funding to make things like floodplain restoration and reconnection, which are actually far more cost effective and don't add to potentially the housing inventory crisis, while also still building the flood resilience. So just opening that eligibility up, not necessarily changing the dollar amount that's in there.
Because if you do that right, you can basically lower the flood, where the flood zone is, and so those houses are no longer flood zone and don't need to be remediated.
Yeah, a perfect example is down in Brattleboro. There is a project on the Melrose Terrace site, for anybody from Wyndham in here, that it's a $2 to $3 million project. And once they're done restoring that floodplain, they've effectively removed all of one of the tri-park mobile home parks from the floodplain without needing to remove that community from where it is. It's a far more cost-effective, easier lots of natural resource value protections there. Yeah. As an example.
I guess I don't understand how you move the mobile home parks.
You give the water a different place to go by restoring
Oh, okay.
the natural floodplain.
Yeah.
And that essentially means that the water can go someplace safe instead of
All right.
flooding the residential area,
Okay.
Thank you.
right? Is
Yes,
that?
that was perfect.
I think Sarah just answered the question, unless there's more that you would add, but what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, it's a lot of historic fill removal from places where rivers have been cut off from their floodplains. So making access to those spaces where rivers can, jump their banks and go safely, and then reduce floodplain elsewhere. Really, what we would call a choke point. There's not a choke point in the river where it spills up and hits our infrastructure and housing.
So was this a conversation that was had in somewhere in the appropriations or another committee? So it sounds like the language in the budget that is fairly restrictive and says it's not for that purpose.
It says it's for flood resilience for home buyouts.
Yeah.
And so just opening that up so that it can be flood resilience more broadly.
So I'm just wondering, was anybody opposed to that at any point in the budgeting process or anywhere else?
No, not to
Just
my
didn't really
knowledge.
come up.
Yeah. I think the idea is, we can fund that, but just to really codify that in text, I think would be helpful for the state programs that will manage it to know that eligibility is allowed.
Can you talk about what measures could be put in place potentially to prevent lending for development in places where it really doesn't belong? I mean, to try to prevent.
I have a policy strategy on that front when we get there.
Oh, I'm so happy. Well, I think about it a lot. Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask, and this is maybe just specific to Colchester, where I'm from, the land is owned by Hockey. I mean, most of the land that is in a floodplain is owned by Hockey, but the houses are not. So how would that work? Would you negotiate with Hockey and together with the land?
For the buyouts specifically? Yeah, that made home buyouts incredibly challenging. Again, back when I managed it, that was really difficult because the funding has to go to the landowner, and oftentimes there's a different landowner versus the Springboro property owner, which prevented a lot actually of homeowners that live in mobile home parks from accessing it. And they're of course more likely to live in floodplains of river corridors.
This is all floodplain. So, okay.
But some of the mitigation could be upstream,
Yep.
so not even necessarily involving that specific landowner, depending on the circumstance.
Yeah.
Great, let's shift to Abby because she's taken time out, so see what she wants to add, if anything.
Oh, good.
I'm happy for Lauren to continue, and then I can sort of backfill if necessary. I think probably that's going to flow better. Lauren, would you agree?
Abby asked me to be the details person.
Okay.
She can fill in with far more eloquent, high level. I'll go into policy, Abby, and if you want to expand on any of them, let me know, okay?
That sounds great.
And these are again, there are a couple that are very specific for things that are moving in the building now, and some that are kind of longer term thoughts and strategies. So first is one of our priority recommendations from our subcommittee from the Climate Action Plan is support for 30 by 30 conservation, which was passed by the House as H606 and is going to the Senate now. We consider that to be incredibly important both for our natural and working landscape and to more broadly support things like compact settlement development, which was a top priority across all three of the subcommittees on the Climate Council who created strategies. To the question that you asked earlier, and for those who are in-house natural and have heard me talk about this quite a lot, one of the strategy recommendations from our subcommittee again is that we create statewide river corridor protections for undeveloped river corridors to really, for those mapped river corridors that we have in the state, to say, we know these are highly dangerous locations. they should not be developed. And so there's much more on that. I have a one pager that's like very near and dear to my heart for my last job and current, and something that I consider to be a top resilience and public safety strategy for the state. Support for changes made to the use value appraisal system, which was also passed by the House, I believe H697, so that's headed to the Senate as well. That was one of the strategies that we recommended as a subcommittee and the council supported. Again, I have a review of the workforce development bill H703 for the recommendations that we just created. I'm happy to cross-reference those and hope to give you some more specific numbers. Again, broader support for policies that promote compact settlement and reduce land conversion. That was a theme across pretty much all of the many subcommittees within the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. Something that the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Committee asked us to say today was that we make virtual meetings permanent option in open meeting law. I think a bill was passed last year to let it extend for a year, but that is a really critical accessibility component for rural municipalities especially. So finding it in somewhere, whether it's this session or next, to make sure that we're extending that or making it permanent, better yet. And then next year, something for next year for consideration is to use the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Committee is currently working on building out a municipal vulnerability index tool. And that would ideally be available to you all next year for planning purposes and policy purposes, and just to make sure that we're using that tool to direct funding, especially into our more municipally vulnerable or vulnerable areas of the state. And Abby, you might have more. So I'm gonna pass it over to you if you do, or to expand on the importance of any of that.
Well, I guess I would just try to call broader attention, or it has been really difficult within this process to help people understand how critical thinking about food security and food sovereignty is in a climate context. It just didn't seem to be where the neural pathways were trained to go. But I think it's fundamental, right, to our survival. And it's so tied into, again, what I was talking about with the holistic approach to climate. In other words, whatever we can produce here, particularly because of the way that Vermont has chosen to engage with environmental regulations around agriculture, et cetera, in that many are far more stringent here than in other places. You know, whatever we can produce here, we're not then exporting those emissions or those impacts or contributing to the environmental degradation, exporting environmental degradation elsewhere. But it was really, really difficult to help people understand, for example, how, you know, additional funding for slaughterhouse infrastructure tied into a climate strategy or was a climate strategy. But again, from the vantage point of thinking of community resilience, thinking about the fact that 1 in 3 Vermonters were food insecure during the pandemic, thinking about the fact that my own town is what is federally qualified as a food desert. In other words, you have to drive at least 7 miles to get to a grocery store. You know, that is such a fundamental component of community resilience. And so I think I just want to speak to, in the next biennium, how are we thinking about setting up a successful workforce in our food sector? Because we tend to parcel it out differently than that. And I think if we approach it through a food lens, it starts to become a lot clearer how and where and what we want to be investing in order to build out those systems so that our farms can be resilient to produce food to get it to the people in Vermont as we need to be, which is, of course, is going to become even more critical and fundamental as we have more climate migration. So I will leave that. The last thing I would say is just, again, I know that this isn't exciting or whatever. Farming isn't a viable career path, right? That's untenable. And we really need to be grappling with that when we're thinking about workforce capacity. It is not quick thing to teach somebody how to interpret a land base, particularly as extreme weather events are coming in, as we're facing increased drought and increased precipitation, to be able to interpret a land base and produce nourishing, nutrient-dense food after all of those processes are played out. And so we really need to be thinking, I guess I just want to encourage you to continue to think holistically about how you're investing in rural communities, particularly, and in young working families. The places where people can access land tend to be rural, and they tend to be the places where there are inequitable resourcing, whether it's in education, childcare, public transportation, et cetera. And we need to be able to have it such that people who want to come here and try to tie into our food system here have the pieces, the components that they need to be able to support themselves and their livelihoods as they're trying to produce food. And those connections are not, they're not happening right now due to the way that federal agricultural policy works, and then how that ties into how we approach agriculture here in the state. And I think that that's a big shift that we're going to have to engage in. That, again, it's, I know it's not overly exciting, but it seems really fundamentally critical to me, given how much land the farming community stewards and how critical their knowledge base is to ensuring that those lands are as resilient and adaptive as possible as those increased weather events, extreme weather events are coming at us.
I can't help but add that food systems and strengthening local foods is part of the reason why a lot of us are pushing universal meals at school meals, because there is baked into that a strong local purchase incentive. And so you have, in addition to the hunger and some of those food security benefits, you have for smaller diversified producers in the ag sector, a steady, dependable, hungry baseline of client, or what's the right word, customer, in our schools, which are of course all over the state. So that's it's a piece of the food system.
And the one, Chris, Senator Pearson, may I add one more thing? The one additional component to that is that I think that a lot of people maybe don't fully grasp the fact that any ecological or environmental services that farmers are doing, unless they're certified organic and have some of those practices baked into the certification that they're obtaining, they're doing either because it's regulated or out of the goodness of their heart. The marketplace doesn't compensate for riparian plantings, for additional plantings of woody biomass and things like that are going to be really important for sequestration. That's not baked into how farmers are compensated for their stewardship. And so I think, PES is funded again and is continuing. It's going to be really important that whatever comes out of that, we really do try to invest in, because that's saying to our food and farming community, we're going to invest in you becoming climate resilient land stewards, and protect, that we want to invest in you pursuing these environmental strategies in addition to producing food. And we see that that's work that you're not being compensated for, because we're not. And that's one of I see it as like one of the fundamental missing pieces as to why we're sometimes not getting where we want to go, is that we're not connecting the fact that most farmers aren't meeting cost of production. And so anything that's required extra, if they can't afford to do it, they can't afford to do it. And we need to make it so that they can do all of those things. We need to make it so they can plant more trees, so they can learn about agroforestry, so they can pursue all of the, learn more in those regards and have the technical assistance and the resourcing and the funding in order to do those things that are going to make the land base and the ecosystem function as resilient as possible.
Okay, we have just a couple of questions, then we're gonna turn it over to Becca White. So I saw a bunch of hands going up. Let's start.
Okay, yeah, so we were talking about resilience and adaptation and the difficulty of finding metrics for those. And we talked about that in the Energy and Technology Committee when we were drafting the Global Warming Solutions Act. And we sort of punted that to the Climate Council because it is difficult to come up with metrics. But and we couldn't do that in committee. But I think we thought that metrics are possible to figure out. You mentioned the municipality vulnerability index. It seems like we could invent some vulnerability indexes for different sectors, different aspects of the natural landscape and also the economy. I mean, I'm really aware with the war in Europe and the effect that that's had on the oil market worldwide, that really it highlights the vulnerability we all have to the global oil market. And so that's another adaptation, that we should be thinking about. It's not just the environmental adaptation; it's also the economic adaptation. And I don't think we've really thought about it that way in the past, but now it's pretty obvious. So something to think about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Carol, did you have a question?
Was about the universal meal? Is there some section of it that is an output contract that we're promising to pay all the output of certain farms? Is there a percentage that grows that has to be spent from Vermont farmers?
Just quickly, S100 got started in Senate Ag because of this piece, the local incentive. So other states, New York, Michigan, maybe a couple others, have basically challenged schools to and incentivized when you buy 20% of your food locally, we'll give you 20 cents a meal on top. When you hit 25, we'll give you 25 cents. When you hit 30, in New York State, because they produce things like juice and a lot of bakeries and stuff, crackers, they're like eclipsing 50% local. So it's been extremely, for a very modest input of cash. Think of all the business incentives and economic development dollars we're spending. This is a very cheap way to do that. And so we're echoing that. We've done that we put that policy into place. I think it's in law last year. It got cleaved off from 100, but it's fundamental to linking them together and having reliable funding. And it is, we've already funded it for this year. It's like $500,000 for that incentive, just to give you a sense of the scale. It's a small piece, but the foundation's there to have it be eligible for all schools and to ramp up over time. And so I don't know if that answers it, but I may not be an S100 anymore because it was one of those things that pieces were coming in and out, but it has been fundamental to that discussion. That's why it started in Senate Ag.
Do you think that needs to be added back in?
I'll double check that, but I think it went into law last year. Now we just have to come up with the fund. Super. Well, thank you for our guests very much. It's a good update, and it has been pieces that we've talked about here and in committees, but not in that sort of comprehensive way. So I think that for me, that's very valuable, and we have some pieces to watch for in the multi-layered process that we go through. Sarah, can I turn it over to you to tee up
Our next conversation.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Lauren. We really appreciate you being there.
Thanks for your attention and interest to it.
So one of the things that is really helpful in lifting up the work that we're doing as the Climate Solutions Caucus is when we can communicate what we're doing to our constituents and encourage them to tell us, this is what we want you to do, right? Or maybe your neighboring representative doesn't support something that we're working on, and it would be helpful if folks in the neighborhood were leaning on, one of our colleagues down the road. And in order and in order for Vermonters to feel comfortable and confident with the climate progress that we're making, we really need to be communicating each step along the way what we're doing. And so we have social media profiles for the Climate Solutions Caucus. We've got content that's being generated for them. Becca is going to run us through some of that. And Chris and I, try to do regular updates that should also be being pushed out by our social media accounts. But the real ask here is that all of you start echoing and amplifying what we're doing, what we're putting out as a caucus on your own social media platforms, or with a quick front porch forum post, because we're only reaching the 30 to 100 people who are following what the caucus social media platform is, and those are the passionate, committed people. So what we need to do is we need you to help us reaching people who are maybe not yet bought in, but they realize, holy crap, $4 a gallon for gas. I should start thinking about a more fuel efficient vehicle, or an electric, or a hybrid. And so those are the people that we want to start reaching. And so, Becca.
Oh yeah, well, Sarah, I think you said it really. The only thing you should know in addition to that is that we have a Twitter, which is @Climate Caucus. So this is like the one time if you have your phone out and you want to go on Twitter and follow us @Climate Caucus. We have a Facebook page and we have an Instagram page. Or do we have an Instagram page?
No.
No, we don't. Take that back. We do. We could have an Instagram page if more of you were on Instagram and were jumping up and down saying we should. But on both of those platforms, what we've attempted to do is continue to share out the fabulous videos that Sarah and Chris make every single week, or every other week, I apologize. So if you see those pop up on your feed, share them, comment on them, anything like that grows the engagement, as you heard. The other thing that would be really helpful is if there's a topic that's coming up, like let's say the clean heat standard. We had a fabulous op-ed that was written about the clean heat standard by the representative to my left. And when that was shared out, we got a lot of engagement. So if you see either articles or you put something out there that you want to have echoed, send that my way, or just add it, at the Climate Caucus, whatever, on social media. But if something comes up in your feed, just like it, share it, whatever. I promise that will do wonders for our social media. So please, and if you think of ideas for things that you are like, wow, we need to cover that, please send it my way, because that's the hardest part, is generating the content. And then the last thing to pitch to you is we have a graphic. And this graphic is your face or a nice photo of you saying, I'm a climate champion, I'm on the Climate Solutions Caucus. I can make that for you with your name if you tell me you want it for your social media. So I'm happy to take names. And Larry, clear. Oh, Sarita, we got Sarita. We got Chris.
I got t-shirts.
Oh, for you with that outfit, I don't know.
Awesome. Thank you, Becca. And it's all gradually amplifies the profile and helps in our broad strategies.
And I forgot one thing. We are very fortunate that we have Bob the Green Guy, who is a big part of making sure that the content goes out there. So if you also could be kind and follow Bob the Green Guy on his social media, you'll probably see some similar content too.
And that is wrapping us up. I'm going to